Hello, my name is Dan Cavanaugh, and I'm the Curator of Historical Collections at the University of Virginia's Claude Health Sciences Library. Thank you for joining me for this short presentation. UVA's Health Sciences Library is home to a modest collection of rare books, artifacts, manuscripts, and archives that document the history of the health sciences. In recent years, our department has devoted a larger share of our time to one initiative, the improvement of the institutional archive for the UVA health system. There are many parts to this initiative, including the development of procedures to transfer and process born digital records, outreach to student organizations, the creation of new finding aids, and new procedures for capturing online content. No part of this effort has been more significant or rewarding to me than the work we have started to repair the underrepresentation of Black students, faculty, and staff in our institutional archive. Like many places, the collections in our repository have privileged the voices and experiences of white men in positions of power. Our institutional archives were, and still are, dominated by the records of white male physicians, administrators, and students. The biases in our archives have in turn produced biased histories. For example, early in my tenure at UVA for Black History Month, I tried to put together a small lobby exhibit that would touch upon the history of the Black experience and the UVA health system. First, I looked at an older exhibit that may have been produced about 10 or 15 years earlier, and was disappointed that sections detailing the desegregation of UVA Hospital during the 1950s primarily focused on the role white administrators played in this historical development. Then I looked at a student paper that had been done about desegregation of the hospital. It was a well-researched piece, and I learned a great deal from it. But again, white administrators were the central figures in this narrative. My next step was to go through the primary sources in our archive, and it was then clear that the biases in the secondary sources were a reflection of the biases in our records. I had extreme difficulty finding any materials in our collections that documented the voices and experiences of Black students, faculty, and staff. Based on this and other experiences with our archives, in 2017, shortly after I was made head of our department, I made it one of our goals that we would work to repair the biases against African Americans and other historically underrepresented groups in our institutional archive. However, a year later, I have failed to make any progress in this goal. I had made the mistake of adding a new goal without finding new resources to carry it out. The Historical Collections Department of our library consists of 2 full-time archivists and 1 part-time librarian. Together, we are responsible for reference, processing, instruction, acquisitions, exhibit development, and all the other day-to-day work that goes into a special collections unit. We didn't have the time to even fulfill our existing responsibilities and commitments, and it was wrong of me to think that I could find time to do the reparative work that I wanted to do without making strategic cuts to other services. So, in 2018 and 2019, I evaluated our services and resources to develop a new strategic plan. This time I did not only include a goal and action items to repair underrepresentation, I proposed cuts to services and projects to ensure that our department had the time to do this necessary work. What were some of these cuts? Well, we reduced our reading room hours, we ended our artifact digitization project, we also reduced the amount of time we dedicated to the development of our rare book collection, and we stopped providing long-standing recording and editing services for a lecture series that was hosted by our School of Medicine. Most of these cuts were difficult, and getting buy-in from stakeholders took some work, but in the end it was worth it. With a new time, we were finally able to make some significant progress in our reparative work.
One area where we've had progress is with our students in the UVA School of Medicine. 2018, as a part of a wider effort to begin the more regular collection of student organization records, I reached out to the officers of our local chapter of the Student National Medical Association, an organization that has served as an important role in the lives of medical students from underrepresented groups. Although the SNMA has had a chapter at UVA for several decades, we do not have any of their records in our archives. I built a relationship with the officers and discussed the importance of preserving the SNMA records. We established procedures for making annual transfers, and for the past 2 years the organization has given us copies of photographs, Facebook archives, and other records, including these photographs which I have shown here, and this is from a project called the SNMA Immunity Campaign that they the students in this organization led in the weeks following the Unite the Right rallies in August of 2017. Another area where we have seen success is with the UVA Medical Alumni Association. In recent years, the association has done extensive work to become more inclusive and welcoming to Black alumni of the School of Medicine. This year, we had planned to participate in the annual Black alumni events. We had planned oral history interviews with early Black alumni, and my colleague, Emily Bowden, had produced a banner exhibit that featured photographs of our institution's Black alumni, which one of these banners is pictured here. Unfortunately, this event was canceled because of the pandemic, but we hope to participate in the alumni events in 2021. A third area where we have made progress is in bringing to light the stories of African American staff who have worked at UVA Hospital. During the 20th and 21st centuries, UVA Hospital has been the largest employer of African Americans in the Charlottesville-Albemarle region. First because of Jim Crow and later because of institutional racism, African American staff were overrepresented in the lowest paying positions: cooks, orderlies, and housekeeping. Although the work that these people have done is absolutely vital to the success of the hospital, their stories have largely been ignored, and their voices were largely silent in our archives. I wanted to address this gap, but I didn't want to simply put out a call out in the community for oral histories and personal papers. I wanted to make sure that we first invested the time to extensively research our own collections and learn what we could, so we could have something to give potential partners rather than simply asking for others to do the work for us to address gaps in our collection. For 5 to 6 months, I did extensive research of institutional records at our library and at other special collection repositories at UVA, combing through meeting minutes, administrative correspondence, and clippings files to find any scrap of evidence that would shed the light on the history of African American workers at the hospital from 1901 to 1965. What I had learned was incredible. When bits and pieces of evidence were stitched together, I learned that a group of Black hospital workers, including this man shown here, Randolph White, formed the core of the early civil rights movement in Charlottesville and Albemarle County during the 1940s and early 1950s. During World War II, Black workers at UVA staged strikes for a living wage and better working conditions, and ultimately organized into their own Local 550 of the SMWA-CIO. They gained major concessions from white administrators, and their newsletter, which is pictured here, The Beam, was a place where Black workers not only discussed labor issues, but they also covered politics and the civil rights movement. There were instructions for how to vote and announcements for meetings of the local chapter of the NAACP. Labor leaders at the hospital became early civil rights leader for the wider Albemarle-Charlottesville community. Randolph White, who we saw before, the head orderly, was the founder and editor of the Charlottesville-Albemarle Tribune, a paper that served the local Black community from the 1950s and into the 1990s. During the 1940s and 1950s, George Hardy, a cook at UVA Hospital, at one time served as president of Local 550, president of the local branch of the NAACP, and was the second African American in history to run for Charlottesville City Council. He was also a founding leader of the UVA Credit Union in the 1950s. Hospital workers like Randolph White and George Hardy eventually worked to close the hospital's overcrowded basement wards and end segregated patient care. Working with national civil rights organizations like the NAACP and also local civil rights leaders like T.J. Sellers in Charlottesville, hospital workers were able to use a combination of lawsuits, media campaigns, and threatened labor actions to force white administrators at UVA Hospital to begin desegregating patient care. And I have a picture here of a few newspaper articles, clippings of newspaper articles from the Charlottesville Tribune, which is a earlier paper by civil rights activist T.J. Sellers in Charlottesville and Albemarle region. And you'll see here 1950 and 1951 stories about discriminatory pay scales, description of discrimination at UVA Hospital, and also a Charlottesville NAACP funding drive to sue the hospital. So when you look at the history of these long overlooked African American workers at UVA Hospital, we really find that they were responsible for ending desegregation at the institution, rather than the white administrators who feature so prominently in so much of our archives. These stories are pretty much absent from the collective memory of the University of Virginia and the Charlottesville community. So in the past 6 months, I've been sharing this research in presentations at the university and in the community. Although the pandemic has slowed this work down a bit, it has not stopped, and I've been working with members of the local branch of the NAACP to bring these stories to light on Monday, and I'll be giving a talk for their membership via Zoom. In the past few years, we have made mistakes and progress in our work at UVA to address biases in our institutional record. I recognize that we have a lot more work to do. For example, we must address the underrepresentation of other groups, including women, Latinos, and Asian Americans. We must do more to make records that document the experiences of underrepresented groups visible in our catalogs and finding aids. And we must continue to build relationships with Black staff, faculty, and alumni to ensure that they will be represented in our archive in the future. Moving forward, as we do this and other work to address biases in the institutional archives, we will proceed while remembering the lessons we have learned so far. Looking back at the past few years, I'd say the most important lessons are, first, if we are going to do reparative work, we must commit real resources. If we can't find additional resources, we must evaluate our current commitments and make cuts to allow for this work to happen. Second, although our archives are clearly incomplete, important information about underrepresented groups might exist in there. We must commit the time to investigate our own records before asking others to help us with our own gaps. I'm not suggesting that archivists do this work, but perhaps maybe partnering with historians or students. But I think it is important that this work needs to be done. I have found that the research I have done so far about Black workers at UVA Hospital, although very incomplete, has opened doors to new relationships at the university and in the community that would not have otherwise existed for us. And I think this is going to really help us in the future as we continue to work to address gaps in our records. Third, this is not a quick project with a clear deadline. The work to include underrepresented voices in the archive must be a core commitment, and in order for us to succeed, we must be both persistent and patient. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing your questions soon.